OPB Podcasts.
From the basement in the Oregon State Capitol in Salem and the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, February 5th. The state capitol was open for business this week, and much of the building is finally open following years of construction. Lawmakers wasted no time breaking in the new committee rooms and busting out substantive policy bills right from the jump. We'll get into what's on the docket during this 35-day sprint. Plus, Portland's ICE detention center was the scene of a large protest last weekend, and federal officers' use of tear gas landed in the courts. We'll get you up to speed. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB politics reporter Lauren Dake.
I'm OPB politics reporter Dirk Vanderhart.
And I'm OPB Portland City Government reporter Alex Zielinski.
Dirk, let's start with you. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty, let's just quickly note that reporters have returned to the building in force. We have a new office space, which we are both in right now, sitting very closely next to each other. And it has a notable name where we are now recording this podcast from.
Lauren, the Capitol is open again after 3 years sort of out in the cold, working out of an office across the street at Willamette University. OPB once again has an office in the Capitol's entirely new basement. A number of other media organizations do as well. Not only that, but the rotunda is open. Both chambers are fully open. All these little stairways and pathways within the building that, frankly, I had forgotten about as the Capitol was renovated over the last few years are open. I have to say, it is really nice to see the State House almost back to form. The one thing we are still waiting on is the north side of the building, which is still basically a construction site. But you mentioned the name on the press offices. Not long before session, these new press offices were formally named in honor of Peter Wong, the longtime Capitol correspondent for a variety of outlets. Listeners to this podcast probably know that name, I have to guess. Not only that, but there was an event, with 3 governors in attendance, a bunch of dignitaries, all to sort of commemorate the space. But yes, here we are. We are back, as you said, sitting very closely together in our new office.
It's hard to describe the pace of a short session. There's just so much coming at everyone so quickly. So here we are in week 1. Majority Democrats have dropped a bill that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah, and we talked about this last week, but we know more details now. So, Democrats have said for a while they would push a bill disconnecting parts of Oregon's tax code from the tax cuts that were included in that one big, beautiful bill congressional Republicans passed last year. That's because Oregon uses federal taxable income as a starting point for what Oregon's taxpayers owe the state. That bill, because of that, is expected to reduce Oregon's general fund by almost $900 billion this budget. That's a lot of money. So Democrats are trying to close the budget hole, and they want to take some of that money back. They have a bill to do so. This proposal would disconnect Oregon from 3 specific tax breaks in the Trump bill. One helps businesses that make big investments in equipment. One helps people who make a lot of money investing in private companies. One offers a tax deduction for interest paid on car loans. So they want to sort of wipe those off Oregon's books. And severing those pieces would bring in, we are told, about $340 million back into the state's general fund. That's a decent amount of money in the context of the budget hole we're facing. But Democrats also say they want to spend some of that money. They want to create a couple tax credits. Half would be for lower income Oregonians. Half would be for businesses that create jobs in the state. They say that would cost around $50 million. That's the proposal. I know it's wonky, but it is a pretty big deal in the building right now, and I think we should highlight it.
And that was not the only piece of legislation that's so hot right now. What else landed?
Yeah, I think, by any measure, I would say this has been a robust first week of a short session. In fact, just the first day of session was a whirlwind. By Monday afternoon, Democrats in the House had already introduced and started holding hearings on bills to create new gun regulations. There was a proposal that involves safeguarding the right in Oregon to get an abortion or seek transgender care in case outside interests want to interfere with that. Both of those obviously are the kinds of things that tend to become big events in Salem. They generate a lot of emotion, and Democrats were signaling right out of the gate, we are doing these things.
Do you feel like this is different from the Democrat strategy from previous short legislative sessions, or is this sort of like following a familiar playbook?
I think so. It's a short session, right? It's 5 weeks. Limited time is always a factor in these. I don't know if I can remember a start that was this quick just in terms of some of the stuff that is likely to be very controversial. And if I had to guess, I'd say part of the calculus here is Democrats want to leave themselves options. If they're getting these things out and moving early, they may be able to withstand delay tactics by Republicans, things like bill reading, minority reports, all these tried and true mechanisms Republicans can use to sort of sink bills they don't like. This feels like clock management to me in a way.
Yeah. Have you heard anything from the Republicans about this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the tenor has seemed to be a little surprised by the pace. Actually, I got a text from a Republican staffer on Monday who dubbed the first day of session the most bonkers first day of session ever. So, that seems to be part of it. I think both parties, though, are still sort of settling in here. People are wrapping their heads around what's out there, what bills are moving, what doesn't seem to have a chance. They're also just trying to figure out some very pressing budget questions, as we mentioned, and the degree that policy or political disagreements might hamper those seems like an open question because, as you know, like balancing the budget is the sort of cardinal piece of this session, but there can be a lot of distractions.
Okay, so you talked about the disconnect bill. Something else pretty significant that happened this week, which lawmakers and political junkies and pretty much nobody else was waiting for, was the revenue forecast. And that came out yesterday, and it contained a little bit of good news.
I mean, look, this is sort of a make or break moment for the session, right? Lawmakers came into the session on Monday figuring they would need about $750 million. They'd have to find that money to cover a gap in the general fund budget that was brought on largely because of H.R. 1, that big federal bill, but also to address major new costs. Some of those just because program costs are rising, and some of them because of new requirements from the big, beautiful bill. All eyes were on the Wednesday revenue forecast because, with that forecast, the picture was either going to get worse, maybe a lot worse, or better, maybe a lot better, though that felt unlikely. And as you mentioned, state economists said things look a little brighter. They are now expecting the general fund to bring in about $100 million more for the current budget. So theoretically, lawmakers only have to close a $650 million hole rather than that $750 million hole I mentioned. That's good news. It is not going to be enough, I think, to avoid some very tough choices.
And remind us the politics of all this.
Yeah, I mean, look, there is a ton of jockeying on all things budget right now in the Capitol. Actually, later today, as we record this, labor unions and a bunch of progressive groups are going to hold a big rally here at the Capitol. They will be urging lawmakers to avoid major budget cuts in a lot of areas. And I think there is some pressure there to do, a more full disconnect from H.R. 1 than the one that lawmakers proposed earlier this week. They want to bring in even more money that the state expects to lose to those tax cuts. There's also a movement urging lawmakers to not be afraid to tap into the state's very ample reserve funds to avoid any budgetary pain. I think that feels possible in some cases, right? There's a reserve fund for schools. I think lawmakers are seriously looking at tapping that. But remember, the legislature is looking at far, far larger budget cuts in the next 2 budgets to come. And I think there is a real appetite to reserve some of this reserve money. Now, on the other side here, Republicans have been railing against this idea of severing Oregon from pieces of Trump's bill. They say this is going to hike taxes, which are not popular. Oregon's made themselves very clear when they referred the transportation package to the ballot. They don't want gas taxes. Republicans are saying this is all part of the same thing. If Democrats want to claim they are the party of affordability right now, raising taxes, even if it's on businesses or people that are relatively high income earners, is not the way to show that. So they are very much opposing budget cuts. One thing we haven't touched on, though, are another piece of bills that are going to have a big role in this session. Democrats are putting forward all these proposals to tackle what they say is federal overreach, particularly when it comes to ICE enforcement. Lauren, you've been covering this. What have we seen on these issues in the first few days?
Well, I think you've done a good job of just sort of laying out that lawmakers have not been afraid to get to some very meaty bills that are generating a lot of public testimony and are expected to be very contentious. So on top of the guns and the measure that touches gender affirming care, they are taking on this ICE package in week 1. Like that staffer said, it all feels a little bonkers. But one measure that they addressed this week would make it easier for people to sue federal immigration officers if they think their constitutional rights were violated during an immigration enforcement event. And we're seeing kind of similar legislation across the country in other democratically controlled state legislatures. This measure would also require federal law enforcement agencies to notify the Oregon Department of Justice when they're planning an operation in the state. Another bill that got a hearing this week that generated a lot of public testimony is one that we've heard so much about in the last couple months, which is, trying to ensure ICE agents are identifiable. We've all seen the ICE arrests with agents wearing ski masks over their face with no visible badges. There was a hearing on this bill yesterday that would basically prevent law enforcement agents from covering their faces. There's a couple of those bills floating around the session because it's going to be one of those that's very tricky to get at legally. So like we've said on this podcast before, and what you just said, this is really, the session is going to be a lot about trying to push back on what Democrats are seeing as federal overreach. And these ICE bills will really be at the heart of that, which feels like a very nice segue to going back to the Gert Boyle studio where Alex is at and talk about a little bit what's happening in the city of Portland. There seems to be some growing anger, some real angst over what exactly Portland can do to address tear gas that's being used at the South Portland building. Alex, remind us why this has kicked up so much lately.
Yeah, the answer is in your question. Tear gas. Last weekend, federal officers responded to two protests outside their facility in South Portland with clouds of tear gas, flashbangs, and other chemical munitions. This is the second weekend in a row that there's been a ton of tear gas spread through that neighborhood in response to protests. And a lot of attention specifically has been given to the types of people hit with tear gas. The Saturday protest was held by a number of major labor groups and really grabbed headlines because there were children and elderly demonstrators who were in the crowd who were affected. So that stirred up a lot of outrage, more than what we've seen in the past. And Dirk, you mentioned unions speaking out in Salem this week. We also saw a letter from a group of unions today, too, sending a letter to Portland leaders to take action, really respond to this.
And what have we heard from Portland Mayor Keith Wilson on this?
Yeah, he released probably the strongest statement against ICE from his office yet this weekend after that labor march was tear gassed. He urged ICE employees to quit, to leave the facility, to look at themselves in the mirror. He also kind of heeded the city councilors' call to begin enforcing this new policy that levies fees against the landlord of the ICE building every time ICE shoots chemical munitions into the street. Maybe heeding their call is too strong because the policy is really not being enforced yet. But Wilson said he's going to start acting more swiftly to get this new policy passed in December, to get it up and running. So we'll see.
So the issue landed in the courts. Tell us, why and just what happened this week.
Yeah, so lawyers for the ACLU representing a number of protesters, they actually filed a lawsuit against the federal government in November, accusing federal officers of using excessive force against protesters. But after last weekend's response to demonstrators, ACLU asked for a swifter action, demanding the judge overseeing this case issue a restraining order against the federal government to immediately keep officers from using force against nonviolent groups of people in the streets. And on Monday, a judge did just that. The ruling blocks federal officers from using chemical munitions or projectiles unless the target, the person, poses an imminent threat of physical harm to a law enforcement officer or another person. It also blocks munitions from being directed at someone's head, neck, or torso unless the officer is justified in using deadly force. And this order lasts 14 days, but it can and will probably be renewed then.
This feels like another inflection point. What happens next?
Yeah, well, the underlying lawsuit attached to this case I just mentioned has its first hearing in early March. So at that point, these temporary orders, they could turn into a more permanent injunction. In the meantime, there are other levers being pulled in court. Another lawsuit filed by tenants of the low-income apartment building near the ICE building has asked a different federal judge to block the use of chemical munitions as it impacts their homes. And the next hearing on that case is set for February 13th. I believe that's next week. And all the while, the city is trying to use the slow justice of bureaucracy to try and make the ICE building's owner more annoyed, both by imposing these fees on whenever chemicals are being used, but also possibly overturning a land use agreement that the owner has with the city to use that building as a detention facility. So we'll see what comes first.
All right. Well, what a time we are all living through. Dirk and Alex, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast this week. This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded live in the Gert Boyle studio and the Salem Capitol basement. It was produced by Andrew Thien. Our audio engineer is Nalene Silva, and our music comes from Audio Network. We will be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening.